Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm delighted to be welcoming back Steve Mason, who is a font of all knowledge when it comes to ISO standards and in particular information security and service management. So this is the first time that we've talked about the standard ISO 20000 here on the ISO Show. So yeah, very warm welcome, Steve. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mel. It's good to be back.
Yeah, so this standard in particular is an area that we get a lot of interest on YouTube. And I think in the past, it's been perceived as an IT service management standard, but it was updated back in 2018 and it's just known as a service management standard. So yeah, really interested in hearing all about it. And in fact, we're going to be splitting this up into two podcasts because we're going to be talking today about the what is ISO 20000, who can use the standard, what are the benefits, and also how does it fit in with other ISO standards. So that's going to be the main topic of conversation for today. But we're also going to be recording another podcast to provide a bit more of an overview on the standard itself. So you get a bit of a feel for, what's actually included within the clauses so you can put into context how that might fit within your organization. Okay, great. So, yeah, over to you, Steve. I mean, what is ISO 20000?
Well, I'm glad you started off with that explanation about the change from it being an IT service management system or standard into a service management standard. And I think that's why this has become a bit of a poor cousin to 9000 in being promoted.
Sorry, poor cousin. That's a good way of putting it, Steve.
It is a poor cousin, yeah.
Oh, it is. I know. I do feel a bit sorry for this standard because I can remember when I first read the 28. Sorry to interrupt here, but
That's all right.
it just brought a smile to my face, which obviously you can't see on the podcast. But I can remember when I looked at this standard, I was a little bit skeptical about it because I thought, it's just about IT. And it was such an eye opener. And I was thinking, actually, this could apply to any business.
Yes.
I mean, literally any business.
Yeah.
And I think, the title of it in the past has done it a disservice. So, yeah, so let's just kind of, put those preconceptions to one side and carry on.
Yeah. No, that's fine. No, in fact, it's one of my favourite standards. I've always enjoyed either assessing this standard as an assessor in the past or even putting this standard in with clients. And we have had a couple of successes in Blackmores with this standard, so it's a good choice for us.
Can I ask why it's your favourite before you start going? I've got to ask you that question now before you start explaining what it is. Why is it your favourite standard then?
Yeah, it's one of my favourites because I just find it takes some of the aspects of quality a step further and actually gives you much clearer detail on how you can improve your management systems. So if you've got a service management system in any way, shape or form, this is the standard to go to. And when it comes down to auditing, it's one of the easier standards to audit because there's some very simple questions to ask every now and again that can be a bit of a curveball question, but actually highlight where the weaknesses are in your service management. So it's one of those standards that I've seen probably more improvement in when clients have implemented them rather than perhaps looking at, let's say, 9000 as a standard. So yeah, it's one of my favourites in that sense. But
okay, thanks, Steve. So yeah, sorry, I interrupted you there. So
that's
if you could just provide an overview on what 20000 is as a standard, please.
Yeah. So yes, it did start off in the IT world, and it was part of the ITIL framework, and it still does follow that framework in many respects. But now, because it's been widened out to service management as a whole, it can be implemented anywhere. Funny enough, I was watching that TV program the other night, Ambulance, and there's obviously a call room there, so they're taking all the calls. And it could be that 20000 might be a useful management system within a call centre like Ambulance and that sort of thing. What we're looking for is basically anywhere that has a service being delivered to a customer that requires service support afterwards in terms of collecting tickets that might be incident tickets, problem tickets, service requests or even changes, and then delivers to agreed SLAs. If you've got that as your management system in any way, shape or form, this standard is for you. Now, in the past, you may have thought, well, 9,000 will do it for us. No, it won't. 9,000 will give you a bare framework of how to do a quality management system, but it won't give you the fundamental details of how to improve that service management system. And that's where 20,000 comes in. So anyone that's got a service desk, this is a starter for you.
Okay, great. So that could be anything from an IT managed service provider through to, well, any kind of call center really for a service. It could be, providing gas or electricity services, telecoms.
Transport.
Yeah, pretty much anything really. And also obviously retailers as well, because a lot of businesses have moved away from the high street, haven't they? They're online or
And online, that's right. Yeah, it'd be very much suited to them.
exactly, yeah. So any kind of, I guess, any help facility as well. So, like now you have a bot that pops up, don't you, for a little chat on there. And obviously that can be pre-populated with certain information, but a lot of the correspondence is online.
It could be, as much as I hate them, but
Exactly. It's either online or over the phone, isn't it? Rather than kind of face to face now. So, yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And it's also geared at making sure that when you take on these issues, you're grouping them together under the customer you're providing the service for. And so that when that customer keeps coming back, you then understand the history of their problems and things like that. So, there are good tools out there that can be used. I mean, some of the typical tools that people might be using at the moment are things like Autotask, Auto Manager. They might be using ServiceNow, all those sorts of tools. They're the ones that give you the indicator that actually this standard is probably intended for you.
Okay, great. And as I said earlier, we will record another podcast to go into a bit more detail about the clauses, but could you just give a bit of a high level overview, please, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, as a standard, it follows the high-level standard clauses that we've all been used to under 9,000, under 27, and all the other standards that are out there. And all this does is just fills in the gaps in clause 8. So we start off with the usual context of the organisation, which leads into the leadership, into planning, and then into the support of the service. Now, in many cases, if you've got another standard in existence, perhaps 9,000 or 27, much of that is already in place. So all you're going to have to do is do a bit of tweaking around that. Then when we get down into the operational side, it gets nicely split down into different scenarios. So we get what's known as the service portfolio. We then get relationship agreements. We get supply and demand. Then there's service design, build and transition, resolution and fulfillment, and service assurance. Now, many people that are into service management will probably recognize some of those terms. They may not call them quite the same thing, but they're certainly terms that are familiar within service management. After that, we would then have the usual sort of internal audits, management review and continual improvement, which you would recognize in any other standard.
Okay, yeah, I mean, when you mentioned about relationships and agreements, the thing that comes to mind is service level agreements and making sure that that's clearly communicated and delivered, which ties into the service assurance part, doesn't it? So I think especially if there are any potential fines around, failure to meet service levels, then I would say that this would probably be a business critical area for a lot of those types of organisations.
Very much so, and it can be a money-saving area as well, because if you get your services right using this standard, it means you're going to end up with less fines in those service level agreements. The other thing it does sort of encourage you to think about is OLAs, operating level agreements. Now, those are agreements that are set up between departments within organisations. So you may have to rely with this standard on another department to provide a piece of work or an activity. What's your expectation of that? So give an example. It might be that you rely on facilities to make sure that the electricity and the heating is going, sort of thing. And you might have an OLA in place for that. So that sort of thing. I suggested the other day an OLA to an organisation where they were trying to get product returned from their staff out in the field, all working from home. And it wasn't always going as well as they wanted. So I said, well, why not set an OLA as to how quickly you want that equipment returned? So you basically say, right, once you get your new piece of equipment, you have 7 days to return the faulty equipment. And that was really taken up as a great idea. So really, OLAs are about those agreements and setting in defined sort of measures of agreement with other people or other departments in the company.
Yeah, I like the sound of that. So you can have like internal KPIs as, service delivery partners internally, kind of across functions. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, makes a lot of sense. So what would you say are the main benefits then of ISO 20000, Steve?
Oh, right. Okay. It could be varied in that sense. Yeah, I think first of all, it can improve the planning and introduction of services. So we may already have a good management system in place that's running a brilliant service. But what happens if you want to introduce a new service? This standard would help you understand what it is you need to do to introduce that new service. Go through the planning, you test a new service out, and the service will always be introduced through a proper change management system and a release and deployment management system. So you always make sure that's in place. So that's one way of improving things. We just mentioned SLAs and OLAs. Often companies don't have those fully in place. This standard pushes you in that direction. So it says that, if you want to get things right, these are the things that you need to be thinking about. It does help to reduce employee stress in many cases. If we take something like service requests, this is when, I might be phoning my IT department and asking for a new laptop or a keyboard or for a mouse. If the IT department have got it right and they've introduced what's known as self-service, it takes the stress off of the back of IT. And so I can request my mouse through self-service and it then turns up hopefully a few days later. The other way it reduces stress is that when you're dealing with incidents and problems, you create what's known as knowledge articles. And this will help you resolve issues as they come up, because you'll get an incident come up, you'll check your knowledge article. Oh, that's how we resolved it last time. Let's resolve it the same way this time. So you can deal with tickets that way. Plus, you can also use this system to manage your ticket queues. Good example here is that I once went to an organisation that had a ticket queue of outstanding tickets. There were 800 tickets long. And we used this standard, and those 800 tickets, by the way, they went back several years. They went back about 2 years. So we used this standard to actually reduce that ticket level down to a manageable level of about 25 to 30 tickets that were all live and all moving. And that's how good this standard is. That's why I love this standard, because you can do magic like that. So if there's anybody listening to this podcast that's got that sort of sword of Damocles hanging over them of outstanding tickets, this is the one to go to, and I'll give you advice and guidance on how you can reduce those ticket queues and keep them reduced. And that's the important thing. How do you keep ticket queues reduced?
Oh, I was just going to say, you don't necessarily want like a linear approach to this, just, reduce them once and then that's it. You want that kind of residual impact, don't you, to keep that, to have robust processes so you can optimize use of your time and not have extra stress and worry about hundreds of unnecessary, well, I guess in terms of the management of the tickets.
Yeah, and there's a good point there. And I think the other thing that with all this sort of going into place, it can, and I've seen organisations report back that this standard has actually saved them not only time, but also finance. So there's some great benefits there. So it's certainly a standard to take seriously and have a good look at. And if nothing else, do a gap analysis around it and understand how it can benefit you as an organisation.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, as we're talking about this, because it's been a little while since we've talked about this particular standard, Steve, I'm just thinking it would be great to introduce in our organisation, because obviously we have a lot of clients that we work with to help to implement ISO standards and also to maintain standards for hundreds of businesses. So yeah, I think this is something that we need to book that gap analysis in with you to do that actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully in Q4 2023. But if any of our ISO show listeners are thinking, I'm intrigued about this ISO 20000, like to find out a bit more about it, I mean, obviously you can go and purchase the standard, which is first part of call, but also over in our ISology Hub, our online digital platform for all things ISO, we've got various training resources and tools in the toolkit, which you can then get access to if you're a subscriber to that. So if you're interested in that, just go along to www.isologyhub.com to get access to that. Or if you'd like to find out a little bit more and speak to Steve about a gap analysis, then we can arrange that as well. So all of the contact details will be linked in the show notes that go alongside this podcast. So yeah, so just to wrap then, Steve, I think one of the things that we wanted to touch on was about the interaction of this particular standard in relation to other standards. You did touch on 27001 and 9001.
Yeah.
So let's just explore that in a little bit more detail. What would you say are the main ways that this standard fits in with the other standards?
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, if we look at clause 8 of 9001, we know that's the bit that talks about the operation of quality. And if you've got a service you're providing to your customers, you might then say, well, what is there in clause 8 of 20,000 that I can use to improve that? So, i.e., sort of understanding the needs and expectations of your customers, getting that clearly defined. It might be that you want to put together a good service portfolio, which is basically the offering that you have to your customer. So it's very clear to your customer what it is you're giving them. So the portfolio would include things like a service catalog. It might also include asset management if that comes into play in your part of the service management. So you're basically sort of saying, what is there in 9,000 that I could expand on, and what can I take out of 20,000 that would actually take that step further? So I've got clients, or had clients in the past that have got 9,000, but we get to certain points and they'll suddenly say, well, if we want to look at this, we need to audit 20,000 because that's where the detail is. So you won't be doing things twice, you'll just be expanding upon what you're doing in 9,000. So that's really where 9,000 fits in. 27,000, there is a requirement in this standard to have information security management. It doesn't actually say that you've got to have 27,001, but it does require you to have a security policy, and it does require you to have an incident management system, and it does require you to understand sort of certain controls around security and demonstrate how those controls have been implemented. Now, many of the time that a client will have 27,001 in place, and as soon as we get to this clause in the standard, it's almost a tick in the box. So, and all you've got to really do is say, right, you've got 27,001 in place. How is that impacting your services and that sort of thing? So that's really where that comes in. The other part of security as well would be access control, because sometimes you might have portals that your customer is accessing, and you want to make sure the access control is up to date. So again, security is a good standard to support you there. And in the same section of the standard, you've got service continuity management. Now that fits in nicely with the business continuity standards that are around, like 22301. Now, whilst business continuity looks at the broader picture of the business, service continuity will look at let's say, the detail of the service continuing with the customer. Now, it may be that you don't have a scenario of a business continuity kick in. It may be that service continuity is kicked in because something's gone wrong in the provision of an aspect of your service. So, but you need to have some sort of service continuity management in place. And there are lessons actually that can be learned from business continuity in 22301 that can be applied here in 20,000. So they do fit nicely together. They dovetail together in that sense.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And going back to the example that you mentioned earlier about the ambulance service, that service continuity, the call centres and being able to provide that service 24/7 is obviously critical.
Yeah.
And likewise, charities, there are a lot of charities that have ISO 9001, and I know we work with a number of them on some of the other standards like 27,001 and 22301. But yeah, I can see where the service continuity would definitely be complementary as well, for being able to provide those services 24/7 and facilities management companies as well. If something goes wrong with a building, you want to make sure that, if you're paying for those services, that your facilities management company has 20,000 in place as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's an interesting one. You mentioned facilities, because there is a similar standard to this, which is ISO 41001, that is a facilities service management standard, but it doesn't go into as much detail as 20,000. So that's an interesting point, that it may be that 41,000 doesn't meet your needs because it's too simple, and that this one is the one that really meets your needs because it covers all aspects of service management.
Food for thought there, Steve. Great. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today. I know that we are going to dive into the standard in a lot more detail on the next podcast. So, yeah, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing those insights with our ISO Show listeners today.
It's a pleasure.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks once again for listening to the podcast today. And like I said earlier, if there's any support that you might need in relation to ISO 20000, whether that's online via our digital portal, the ISology Hub, then just go along to www.isologyhub.com or get in contact with us if you're looking to do a gap analysis. And finally, if you've enjoyed listening to the podcast today, if you've learned something new, it'd be great if you could share that with anybody else that you know that you think, that could be a bit of an aha moment for a colleague or, a client or another contact that you've got within the profession. So please do like and share the podcast. And don't forget to leave us a review if you don't mind, because that really does help us to grow our audience of those people that absolutely love ISO standards like we do. And believe it or not, there are a few people out there. So when you do leave a review, it does help us to grow and share the ISO love. Okay, thanks once again for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next podcast when Steve will be joining us to dive into a bit more information on ISO 20000.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.